Hello and welcome to our webinar presenting the final deliverables from our Pacific Northwest Storage Roadmap study. My name is Kavya Niranjan and I'm the Senior Markets and Transmission Policy Manager at Renewable Northwest, and I will be your MC for today. To those of you that are already familiar with our organization, welcome. To those of you that are newer to who we are and what we do, I thought I'd just give a quick introduction. Renewable Northwest is a clean energy policy and advocacy organization focused on the 4 Northwest states. So that's Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. We are membership-based, and our members represent a pretty diverse cross-section of the clean energy landscape, including developers, environmental groups, law firms, engineering consultants, so on and so forth. This webinar is the final stage of a work stream we started well over a year ago when we reached out to our members, particularly our storage developer members, to figure out how we could better support them. Over time and with new information, that initial work has since evolved into several different work streams here at Renewable Northwest. I'll talk about a few of those in a second. But this project is really the first of those that we're putting out there, and it's meant to set the stage and be a big picture look at some of the major opportunities, but also the major regulatory challenges for storage deployment in our region. I'll just call to everyone's attention that this is a public webinar, one of the first public webinars we're hosting here at Renewable Northwest, meaning it's not just for our members. We've also extended invitations to legislators and their staff, regulators and their staff, state energy offices and agencies, BPA, consultants, other clean energy advocates. I just mentioned that so that everyone in the room can be aware and mindful that this is a wider audience than usual for us. This webinar will also be recorded and posted to our website afterwards, and it is scheduled for a full 90 minutes. A few more things before we get into the presentations. I wanted to highlight a few other members of our staff that can serve as key points of contact for this work, but also all of our other storage-related work as well. First and foremost is Mike Getz. He is our Regulatory Affairs Director and is leading our second major scope of work around analysis for storage ELCCs. The results of that study should be coming out very shortly. He'll be moderating a panel at the News Data Conference next week where we'll share the preliminary results, and he'll be your point of contact for that analysis moving forward. The second and third people are Emily Butterfield, who is our comms manager. She is supporting the Zoom call on the back end. Thank you, Emily. And Adam Capage, who is our outreach director. They are leading our third big scope of work focused on education at the local and county level around land use, permitting, fire safety concerns, etc. They are also leading our broader sort of campaign-style comms strategy around BESS and storage. Last but not least, I wanted to call out Abby Sperling, our development associate. She is point on organizing our upcoming fall member retreat, which is coming up very quickly, the last week of September in Skamania. Most of our members will hopefully already be there, but if you are interested at all in who we are as an organization and what it means to be a member, please do reach out to her. She'll be happy to share information about the retreat, information about membership. She's your person for that. And Emily has just dropped all of those emails in the chat. With some of that housekeeping out of the way, time to turn focus to the presentation itself. I want to welcome the Aurora Energy Research Project team to this webinar. They have been working closely with us and our members over the past few months to put this roadmap together. There have been several iterations, and it is a very comprehensive assessment. In fact, Aurora will be presenting select slides from the roadmap for the purposes of this webinar. Otherwise, we just would not get through all the material. But the full versions of both this roadmap and a condensed white paper have been posted to our website and are available there now. Just to quickly touch on the structure and format for this webinar, we're planning to give Aurora the full hour 10, hour 15 to present the material. Feel free to throw questions in the chat as we're going along. We'll save a record of that, but we'll mostly plan to save the meat of the audience Q&A for the last 10 or 15 minutes. We recognize that's not a whole lot of time for discussion, but as I said, it's a lot of material to get through. And I think what we really want to encourage is people to reach out. We're very interested in questions, reactions, feedback. We're very much seeing this as a first pass, a first foray into our storage work. Any additional comments we receive will only help us tailor the next iteration of this work. So we really welcome the engagement. To that end, as I mentioned, Emily's dropped my email in the chat as well. I'm happy to be the first point of contact for any of this work. If I can't answer the questions, I will find the person that can. And with that, I think we'll jump into the presentation. I'll pass it to the Aurora team. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Kavya. Um, just a quick intro. My name is Felix Chow, and I'm joined here today with my co-authors at Aurora, Nina Blehut and Alex Yang, who are on the line here. Um, so let me quickly set the stage before we dive in. So as you all know, electricity systems around the country are under pressure on three fronts, really. So you've got load growth is growing for the first time in decades, driven not only by data centers, but also, electrification and population growth. With that load growth, you're seeing an aging thermal fleet, with the older coal assets coming offline, as well as utilities switching to renewable energy sources to meet their renewable targets. And then interconnection queues are severely backlogged. So, no, this is definitely a national phenomenon, but the Pacific Northwest has its own unique version of what I just described. So, the region itself, it's starting off in a position of strength. It has an abundance of hydropower, which has historically provided low-cost, reliable energy. That being said, that foundation is being tested. Washington and Oregon specifically, you have the utilities that are winding down their coal contracts, really to meet their state's clean energy targets, although some of the utilities have their own targets they're meeting. You're seeing BPA's interconnection queue struggling to handle the volume of renewables and storage that are now seeking access. And then for the first time in its history, the West is getting an RTO-like environment through the extended day ahead market that's led out of CAISO and the Markets Plus system led out of SPP. But also you have emerging resource adequacy programs like RAP. These programs are bringing in more transparent pricing and regional coordination for the Pacific Northwest. So it's against this backdrop that Aurora is proud to be partnering here with Renewable Northwest on this study. So our team has built a comprehensive assessment on storage's role in the region, but the message is actually really simple. How we see it, the Pacific Northwest power system is facing challenges. Storage, which we hope to show, is a very good solution for these challenges. However, the current market and planning frameworks undervalue storage, and we're going to recommend a few targeted policy reforms that can unlock storage at scale. So with that overview aside, let me pass it on to the team to walk through some of the findings.
Thank you, Felix. We'll dive right into the report first with the opportunities and the barriers for storage development. Storage provides three main core services, and they're capacity, energy shifting, and ancillary services. It's able to provide very firm, dispatchable capacity to meet those peak demands and reliability needs. At the same time, it's able to store those excess low cost and surplus generation from perhaps midday solar generation and discharge them during the high demand periods. And of course, it's also able to provide those dispatchable and very crucial balancing energy to manage the forecast errors and intraday variability that constitutes as part of the ancillary services. There's also an ongoing transition in the region's grid that increases the very need for the services that storage provides. We have identified four main grid transition drivers/barriers. First, we're seeing an increased load growth, as Felix mentioned, driven largely by population, electrification, economic development, and data center deployment. Second, we're seeing a shrinking thermal fleet driven by its age as well as the clean energy standards in both Washington and Oregon. Third, there is an increasing amount of renewable deployment in the region as well. And lastly, there's also a lot of transmission constraints driven by the BPA's transmission queue delays. Storage, with its three core services, is able to address a lot of these issues head on, and we'll take a deep dive into each categories right now. Let's take a look at the capacity first. The region is experiencing a peak demand growth that's unlike anything we've seen before and creating a gap and a need for firm capacity. Storage can step in perfectly to fill that gap. On the left-hand side, we have outlined the Pacific Northwest peak total demand based on Aurora's forecasted view, and where we are seeing a sustained load growth for the first time in decades. That combined with thermal retirement, it's all tightening the resource adequacy in the region and creating that need for firm capacity such as battery storage. Storage at the same time has also the shortest construction time, making it a great choice to address the near-term rapid growth as we're seeing in the chart to the left. We also have outlined the average construction time where we're only seeing 3 years for battery storage compared to that of 5 for thermal and 10 for hydro. Specifically for thermal CCGT, that lead time have jumped from 3.5 years in 2023 to 5 years in 25. That's caused by the 80 gigawatts of turbine ordered in 24 against a production capacity of only 30 gigawatts per year. Moving on with the conversation as part of the core services, storage can, with its energy shifting capability, can support a lot of the renewables coming online in the region. In this chart on the left, we have illustrated the demand and renewable generation on the top, as well as the illustrative hourly price and battery charging and discharging behavior on the bottom. Where we're seeing in the green boxes on the top is when solar is generating in the midday. However, that peak generation period misses the peak demand period, and that's where battery storage can step in and charge during the midday and discharge during the peak demand period to shift that energy around. And we can go to the next slide. And given the unique transmission constraints in the region, storage can ease that congestion and lower the overall system cost. On the left, we have outlined a map of the Pacific Northwest where we can see the Cascades Mountain Range naturally creates a separation of the generation side to the east and the load side to the west, where we're seeing a lot of the wind and solar is trying to cross over the mountains and creating a lot of those congestions. So all of this results in periods of excess low-cost supply in the east and scarcity in the west, increasing the need to shift that energy across the constrained mountain ranges. So if we're siting storage close to the constraints, it allows it to directly absorb those excess generation or serve the nearby load, reducing the power flow and alleviate those congestion. As the region moves toward a more centralized market under EDAM and Markets Plus, those congestion-driven price signals will become even more explicit and further incentivize storage to operate ways to alleviate those transmission constraints. And lastly, storage can provide those very crucial ancillary service to the region at a much lower cost and a faster fashion. Ancillary service requirement in the Pacific Northwest will likely increase as renewable penetration and electricity demand grows and thermal resources retire. Battery storage is very well positioned to meet those needs because of its rapid response capability, as we have outlined in the chart to the left, compared to other forms of technologies. Comparing to a traditional thermal asset, batteries could also provide those service without the fuel consumption and deliver those service at a more cost-effective manner than thermal generators. And as an add-on bonus, it also has the shortest average construction time, as we have mentioned before.
So hopefully that was clear in how storage is able to contribute to not just to any energy system, but specifically for the Pacific Northwest. Alex was outlining how the capacity attributes, energy and ancillary attributes are valuable for the Pacific Northwest. So now I'll pass it on to Nina to go through from slide 11 onwards on why we're not seeing more storage in the region.
Thank you, Felix and Alex. So yeah, all of these benefits bring us to the question of why aren't we seeing more storage in the Pacific Northwest? And that comes down to four key barriers that we've highlighted here. So first, we have that new regionalized markets in the West still don't have complete ancillary service markets. So a big chunk of storage's value is going unpriced. Second, we have that utility procurement is centered on capacity mandates that miss storage's full contributions. Third, outdated interconnection queue processes are constraining market access. And fourth, planning frameworks that exclude clean energy goals tend to favor new thermal, which can lock out storage for decades. So that's a quick overview, and now I'll take each of those key barriers one at a time over these next slides, starting here with the market design. So to recap, this first barrier is that even with the new regional markets in the West, storage's ancillary services value is still going unpriced, which hurts project economics and obscures the value of storage from planners. So backing up with a little bit more context, Western power markets have historically run on bilateral contracts and had very little regional coordination, but that is now changing with the creation of full day-ahead markets, EDAM, and Markets Plus. This table here is comparing how storage revenue streams are changing before and after this process of regionalization. So before, in the pre-regionalization column, you can see that storage received bundled PPAs for both their energy and capacity attributes, which obscured what storage was really worth in both of those respects. And then after regionalization, day-ahead markets will provide clear signals on the value of storage's energy, and the voluntary RA program, or RAP, will price storage's capacity contributions. But even after regionalization, there still aren't any ancillary services markets to provide a clear price signal for the value that storage provides in terms of ancillary services. And this matters because ancillaries can often play a key role in storage project economics, and that's especially true when storage is just starting to deploy at scale in a market. As an example of that, in CAISO, ancillary services made up a large portion of battery revenues in the early years when storage was just starting to take off in California. So the bottom line here is that without an ancillary service market, it's more difficult for projects to be fully compensated for their value. And planners also can't see that value, which brings us here to our second barrier, which is that both utility integrated resource planning processes and the cost of service regulation can undervalue storage, which then leads utilities to procure less storage than would actually benefit the system. So during the integrated resource planning process, utilities are optimizing their portfolios to meet a capacity requirement at least cost. This can be an issue for storage because storage is often treated conservatively for its contribution to capacity. And on top of that, the optimization models in this capacity planning process often don't account for storage's other benefits like transmission deferral or congestion relief. And to illustrate that, the chart on the right is showing the full range of storage's system contribution versus the subset that utility planning processes capture on the right. So in summary, storage ends up looking more unfavorable in the planning process than it actually is, and as a result, utilities procure less storage. And then on the incentive side, under the cost of service regulation that prevails in the Pacific Northwest, utilities earn their returns based on capital spent. So they're incentivized toward expensive investments rather than procurement decisions that would lower system cost. And this can also lead to lower storage procurement. And then moving to the next slide, the third barrier is BPA's slow interconnection queue. And this blocks storage directly, but it also holds back renewables. And since storage and renewables work together, fewer renewables on the grid also mean less storage. So starting out, to illustrate the magnitude of the problems with the queue, there are currently over 87 gigawatts of storage and renewable capacity sitting in Bonneville Power Administration's an interconnection queue. And in comparison to that, only about 2 gigawatts moved through in 2026. So that just goes to show it's a very lengthy process for projects to actually get connected to the grid. And Bonneville Power Administration owns about 75% of transmission in the Pacific Northwest, so it's acting as a gate for almost all new projects. And the underlying reason that the queue is so slow is because it was designed for an earlier era where there wasn't such a high volume of renewable and storage requests. So, as I said up top, there are two impacts here. The direct one is that the queue can literally just stop storage projects from connecting to the grid. And then the knock-on effect is that by limiting renewable build-out, it reduces the price volatility and ancillary demand that makes storage so valuable for the system in the first place. And this barrier is definitely in flux. BPA's new administrator, Travis Fabula, has spoken about encouraging transmission, generation, and storage development, and BPA has recently shifted to a cluster study model. So it's definitely an evolving barrier, but remains a key challenge for storage deployment in the region. And that brings us to our fourth barrier, which is that without clean energy targets being taken seriously, utilities often default to building new thermal. And once that thermal gets built, it can lock out storage for decades and make achieving clean energy targets that much more difficult. So two factors that I just covered can push utilities towards procuring thermal. First is constrained interconnection, since gas guarantees more accredited capacity per megawatt, so it's a safer bet for achieving reliability needs sometimes. And second, cost of service incentives, since they favor capital-intensive builds like thermal. So clean energy targets can act as a counter to those poles, but when they're absent or deprioritized, thermal can win instead. So summarized on the left side of the slide here, we have state renewable policy targets. So Montana and Idaho don't have any targets, and then Oregon and Washington target 100% emissions reduction by 2040 and 45 respectively. And then on the right, we've summarized some notable near-term thermal additions with examples of new thermal projects coming on in Idaho and Washington over the next few years. So this just goes to show that even in states with clean energy targets, we're still seeing the build of new thermal driven by this near-term reliability pressure and interconnection queue delays. And then once these plants are built, they end up taking the place of storage for their entire lifetime. And in doing so, they block storage from its potential to enable a clean transition. And so that covers the four key barriers that we identified. And I'll pass it over to Felix.
Yeah, so No, so far we've covered the basics, right? Energy, capacity, and ancillaries. But there's actually a whole lot of new use cases that are bonuses if you incorporate storage into the system. So we're going to go through a couple. Our full report has a longer list of emerging use cases. But the first one I'll highlight is long duration storage. So these technologies are capable of providing longer, so 8 hour, 10 hour, 12 hour, multi-hour, or even multi-day storage, a lot more than what standard storage right now is kind of the 2 to 4 hour, in some cases 1 to 4 hour range, those batteries. So it's a different, longer duration, different type of storage, and can therefore like meaningfully play a different role in the system. So this matters specifically for the Pacific Northwest because of how the generation mix is different, and how winter stress events can last multiple days rather than several hours. So Pacific Core has recognized this, and in the IRPs they're already calling for these types of longer duration storage. So the good news is, as we show on this slide, is that these technologies are maturing, and we're seeing a few examples here illustrated from iron flow technology, iron air technology, flow batteries, as well as compressed air energy storage. So these examples are, real deals being signed. So, on the iron air example on the left, you see there, Google and Excel have a 300 megawatt um, project in MISO. That's a 10-hour duration storage. And on the middle flow batteries, you have another 10-hour project, compressed air with HydroStore, the example there in CAISO, that's an 8-hour project. So these are actual projects that are being put in, still relatively early stage to see at scale. But I think given the types of reliability needs in Pacific Northwest, the longer duration storage is helpful. Um, of course, no, we talked about barriers earlier. There are definitely barriers in the Pacific Northwest, and really it's about incentives mechanisms. There aren't any explicit incentives that value the longer duration storage. So really thinking about what reforms can we do to encourage this type of storage in the Pacific Northwest. The second emerging use case that we've identified is storage as a transmission asset. So it's often faster and cheaper to put in a battery than to upgrade a line. And that's really the concept, right? So we can see illustrated on the top left here, just an example, you have a 200 megawatt line limit, but the flow, once exceed that 200 megawatts because of just how the generation and the demand is in that location, which, in practice, it doesn't get overloaded. You manage it with curtailing the generation. So the traditional method in dealing with this is to upgrade that line, right? Upgrade that line from 200 megawatts to maybe 300 megawatts to allow for all of that flow. But alternatively, instead of upgrading that line, you can insert a battery. As in that example on the left there, the battery will absorb charge during that period, absorb some of that energy flow, and then leave it for later on in the day when that line is less constrained. So this delays the need for that line upgrade. And we're seeing real world examples of this. So in the green boxes in the middle is a couple that we've pulled out. So in Nantucket, it's a 6 megawatt battery, 48 megawatt hour. This was built in 2019, and by putting a battery in instead of upgrading that transmission, it's able to defer that transmission upgrade for 13 years. So that's a 1.8x benefit relative to project costs. So some promising examples there. We mentioned the Pacific Northwest, the Cascades, the mountain range is a major constraint. So definitely we're seeing how adding storage can give opportunities to work around those constraints. So you have solar really expanding on the east of the Cascades, but that transmission pathway to the coast there, to your Seattle and Portland load centers, those challenges in constraints can definitely be helped by putting in storage instead of building more lines. So this is, definitely an area that is not new, and we're already seeing plays in the Pacific Northwest towards some of this. So Puget Sound Energy, as an example, they ran a non-wires RFP to consider alternative ways of upgrading their network. I mean, ultimately, that example did not lead to storage as a transmission asset, but this is definitely the right direction. So, I think all in all, this is a helpful opportunity. And really, the barrier in achieving this is, again, incentives, right? Utilities aren't necessarily incentivized to choose this as a solution. They're incentivized to, gain returns on the capital investments. So incentivized to build more capex. So this is where perhaps targeted reforms on their incentives can help encourage this use case. So there's a couple of use cases, but let me change track and actually go into some real world examples and what is working, right? So you have definitely other markets where storage is deployed at scale. So, you see on the map here, CAISO and ERCOT are by far the leaders in storage. Storage we've highlighted in those various circles, with yellow being standalone storage and green being the co-located storage. And with about 15, it's actually a bit more right now because this is 2025 data, but more than 15 gigawatts in CAISO and more than 11 gigawatts in ERCOT. That's a lot further deployment in storage, and that kind of illustrates what can work in other markets, but also I think the opportunity that is available for the Pacific Northwest. So you can see in the Pacific Northwest in the map there aren't very many circles over there. That being said, the drivers of each of these markets are different, right? Like that, not all of these markets are the same, and there's some unique features of each market. So in CAISO, it's really the solar penetration, solar coming in that is creating energy arb opportunities. And as a knock-on effect, there's also a lot of state procurement mandates to create set incentives for utilities to contract CAISO batteries. Whereas in ERCOT, it's a very different market. There's no resource adequacy revenue stream, but very volatile energy prices. So the ERCOT battery play is really about mitigating volatility in the pricing markets, the real-time and day-ahead markets, as well as ancillary revenues. So let's dive into each of these markets a little bit more to see what we can learn in the Pacific Northwest from these markets. So with California, the growth has been remarkable, right? Grid scale batteries have gone from virtually 0 10 years ago to 15 gigawatts today. So really the two factors that drive this that perhaps can carry lessons for the Pacific Northwest. So the first factor is solar build out. So solar build out, which we also plot in that screen, solar has tripled over this same decade. And that's resulting in the need for battery storage to manage the variability of that solar. How it manifests in the system is bigger power price spreads that create the price signal for storage to come in. But at the same time, there's the other price signal, which is resource adequacy, where the solar contribution to RA is lower than traditional thermal assets, which means storage is needed to provide that resource capacity need as well. The second driver, and arguably more important driver that CAISO has is state-led procurement mandates. So the California PUC has been quite forward-thinking on this front, mandating at various points in history that load-serving entities procure storage specifically. So we outline a couple of examples there on the bottom of the chart, but specifically where requiring load-serving entities to procure storage has been a big reason for the contracting of batteries in California. So some inspiration for Pacific Northwest perhaps. Moving on to lessons from ERCOT. So ERCOT also a big growth story, but as I mentioned earlier, a very different, structurally different market. So ERCOT not having procurement mandates, not having RA, so resource adequacy. The main drivers for ERCOT are really like demand growth and having a market that responds to that, right? So over this period of the last 6 years or so, shown in this graph, we've seen about 15% increase in peak demand in ERCOT. There's a lot of renewables coming in, and ERCOT is a system where there's a lot of wind coming in. And as a result, that's created the market price signals that encourages battery storage in ERCOT. A lot of 2-hour batteries. So on the bottom left there, you see the price signal of the 2-hour spread. That's an example where the price signal has increased over the course of the last couple of years to incentivize the batteries. And then ancillary services, as illustrated on the bottom right, as well as another price signal. So with ERCOT, it's about market pricing and getting the right price signals to encourage battery storage. Although within that one specific product worth calling out is the ECRS program, the Emergency Contingency Reserve Service in ERCOT. So this was introduced in 2023. And when that came in, that was an ancillary service that was particularly effective at incentivizing new batteries. And in a sense, the market is working. So ECRS, I'll draw your attention to that red line in the middle chart. The prices have dropped a lot in response to batteries supply responding to price signals. So, in summary, ERCOT system is about getting the right price signals to incentivize the value that storage can bring.
Cool. Thank you, Felix. Right now, we'll shift our focus onto the emerging policies for storage adoptions. So, a consistent theme both domestically and abroad is that there are a lot of different policies the Pacific Northwest could potentially take as learning lessons to expedite and promote the storage deployment in the region. We have picked 3 examples in this case. First, we have the SPP's consolidated planning process. Essentially, it integrates transmission planning and generator interconnection into a single framework that cut down the interconnection time from 50 months to 10 and 7. A similar process in the Pacific Northwest could speed up the interconnection time quite dramatically. Shifting our focus to a market abroad in Brazil, where it has a similar market composition like the Pacific Northwest, where it has a lot of hydro generation. In recent years, it has seen a shift of renewable development specifically for wind and solar that enabled the demand for storage. However, unlike the free market here, Brazil had decided to go for a state-led procurement with an auction target of combined 2 gigawatts of storage by 2028. So the Pacific Northwest states could do something similar to encourage the state-level build-out for battery storage. At last, in NYISO, the index storage payments essentially guarantees a revenue floor for all the storage developmental projects in the region. Similar process in the Pacific Northwest could signal a very good business case and attract a lot of developers to relocate their focus into the Pacific Northwest. the same time, long storage duration has become another focus of the rising technologies. States across the US have now initiated policies and incentives to support that, and Pacific Northwest, with its unique hydro-dominant system, could also deploy similar incentive to promote the long storage development in the region. Across California, Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia, there are two forms of state policy incentives. One is a state-led procurement, where we are seeing in California, uh, Massachusetts, and Virginia, specific to the duration of the storage, especially for long durations. And then in Massachusetts, and then in New York, there are funding rounds for projects with the long storage duration to promote that specifically.
Great. So thanks for bearing with us through an international tour. We went to Brazil, we went to within the US, various states in California and ERCOT. So the reason why we went through that is to really look at examples around the country, around the world that can provide a framework for how we go forward the Pacific Northwest. So that's exactly what we're going to do in the next section is like having absorbed all these lessons from around the country, around the world. What do we think for the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, thanks. So, as Felix just said, we've got a couple of recommendations, basically synthesizing everything that we just learned, to try to promote the deployment of storage in the Pacific Northwest. And we've grouped those recommendations here by the challenge that each recommendation is targeting. So the categories are utility planning frameworks, limited revenue streams, and development bottlenecks. So under utility planning frameworks, our recommendations are aiming to make the planning process more holistic to spur greater procurement of storage. Under limited revenue streams, the recommendations are focused on making revenue streams more transparent and reflective of storage's full contributions to the system. And then the development bottleneck recommendations are all about enabling faster and easier grid access for storage. And over the next slides, we'll look at each of these more closely, starting with planning frameworks. So yeah, to start here, this table is summarizing some recommendations that we've collected aimed at making storage's full value more visible in utility planning and incentives to ultimately unlock greater procurement. So the first recommendation here is broadly reforming planning frameworks. And by this, we mean moving towards a more holistic approach that actually captures storage's full range of benefits rather than focusing narrowly on meeting capacity targets, as I discussed earlier. So one example of this would be moving from integrated resource planning, which focuses on isolated modeling of the generation system to meet capacity requirements, to integrated system planning, which plans generation, transmission, and distribution together so that it can capture storage's contributions across all three and give a fuller picture of what storage can do for the system. And we think that this kind of holistic planning could likely drive higher procurement of storage by utilities in the Pacific Northwest, given all that storage could do for things like relieving congestion and delaying transmission upgrades that Alex discussed earlier. And on an exciting note, Washington actually has passed a law that will require some utilities to do this type of integrated system planning starting next year. So we'll see how that plays out. And then the second recommendation here is to adopt performance-based rate making in place of the current cost of service model. And the reason for this is that performance-based rate making would incentivize utilities to invest in generation that is the most cost effective rather than the most capital intensive. And in doing so, could sort of tilt the incentive towards procuring storage rather than more expensive resources like thermal. And also, an exciting note in the Pacific Northwest on this recommendation is that Oregon already has efforts underway to move towards performance-based rate making. And we've already seen a couple of other states adopting this rate making as well, with examples in Hawaii and New York State. And then moving to the next slide. Another avenue to increase utility storage procurement is state-led procurement, which Alex and Felix already touched upon with the examples of state-led procurement of storage in Brazil and in California. And so I won't go into this in too much detail, but state-led procurement can sort of cut through those challenges in the utility planning processes or weak market signals that I've touched on to fast track more storage deployment. So it's definitely a more top-down approach, but effective to get more storage on the grid. And then that brings us to our set of recommendations that are aimed at making storage's value more clearly reflected in the revenue streams that are available to it. And this matters for two reasons. One, just to attract more investment for storage, and also give planners clearer signals about how much storage is actually worth to the system, and then lead to more procurement. So the recommendation in the first row here is to develop an ancillary services market. And again, as I discussed, ancillaries are a really important part of storage's value. And without a market that is pricing them transparently, the value goes unrecognized and less storage is likely to get built. And this would likely take some time to fully build out. To give some context, the ancillary service that Felix mentioned in the ERCOT example, ECRS, was just one type of ancillary service that was added to an existing market, and that took about 3 years to be fully developed. And then the next recommendation is to establish stronger RA frameworks. So really just make the pathway for storage to receive capacity payment a bit more transparent and predictable. And so this will likely, to some degree, happen naturally as Markets Plus and EDAM mature, since both of these day-ahead markets already have some degree of resource adequacy system, but they still remain a little bit fragmented or don't have binding requirements. So moving these programs towards something more mandatory, similar to the California model, could make the investment case better for storage and then ultimately lead to more deployment. So I'll wrap it up there because I think those are the two most important examples to highlight, and then pass it off to Alex.
Thank you, Nina.
Mhm.
As we move on with the strategies, addressing the developmental bottleneck is kind of the last step to enable the storage build out, as we're seeing a lot of congestions there. And we have made 3 recommendations in total. The first is to prioritize interconnection queue reform to expand the renewable and storage access to the grid. As we have discussed before, the BPA's queue is facing severe delays and can't keep up with the demand. And with the limited amount of renewable energy deployment, storage has a very hard time finding those energy arbitrage opportunities and limiting its values. And we have outlined also examples that, for example, the SPP's consolidated planning process I've mentioned before, to kind of shift that constrained timeline forward. The second recommendation we make is to remove the barriers requiring storage to have the secure point-to-point transmission rights to be selected as a network resource. The reason being that requiring those point-to-point rights undermines its dispatch behavior, because then it charges and discharges locally and its value resides in only being available on the grid near the large load centers. Markets like PJM and ERCOT have prime examples to either eliminate the point-to-point transmission requirement in ERCOT or allow the storage to participate in the market across multiple nodes without those dedicated transmission rights. And lastly, we'd recommend to streamline the siting and permitting process. The federal permitting introduces a lot of the bottlenecks through the complex environmental review process, as well as a lot of the local permitting process as well. ERCOT, as a prime example, with minimum state-level siting regulation, contributed the market being able to house the enormous amount of operation as we have seen before.
Great. So where does that leave us? Hope in going through this material, you agree with us that there's an immense opportunity for storage to contribute to the Pacific Northwest power system. We identified those challenges in low growth and in retiring thermal fleet. You got the renewable mandates, carbon emission reductions as well. So all of these problems, these challenges, storage is a good solution for. Yet the current market design and planning frameworks undervalue storage. So, we've come up with a list of recommendations here, and hopefully it's contributes to the policy debate, right? So these are targeted reforms that we think can properly value storage and ultimately help bring storage at scale in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll pass it on to Kavya to chair any questions. We have time to open up to questions.
That sounds great. First of all, thank you so much to all three of you for presenting this and doing it well within time. Appreciate it. We do have a few questions that came in. I've tried my best to keep track of them. I may jump around a little bit. I think the first question from Devin Gabby around, he says, since RAP is not a market, but instead a program, how do you envision it driving capacity revenues for storage? More bilateral procurement with participating utilities? I think you did touch on this in one of the final recommendation slides on slide 31. But if there's anything you wanted to add, if not, in general, I'll say for these questions, if it's more of a let's think about it and get back to you, we can definitely do that as well.
No, absolutely. And I think this is where having RAP and the emerging, CAISO's version of the capacity market that's being proposed. I think a first step is having a requirement for utilities and load serving entities to procure enough capacity. And what it might come up as is each of these utilities will have to ensure they have bilateral contracts that meet their capacity obligations through these programs. So I think having an obligation and then translating the contracts is helpful. But then I think there's the extra step is having a transparent pricing mechanism. So RAP doesn't necessarily do that, but I think that's where there's that extra feature of a capacity, like a full-fledged capacity market that is helpful, is have a transparent pricing that others can respond to.
Great. I might jump around a little to touch on one of the other things that we may have an immediate response to. Tim Miller asks, would love to hear your thoughts about how data centers on-site use of storage with dispatch deals with utilities can play into this. I did reference I think there was a slide that we removed from the full deck about storage co-location at data centers. But if there's a high-level takeaway from that slide, if you're prepared to share it, if not, we can again come back to it later as well.
That's right. So we did go through some emerging use cases, and that particular example of data centers did not make the cut to the final presentation. But you're absolutely right. The full report does address how storage can contribute to data center load. So I think the main message there is storage can be very supportive in data centers, both in terms of its speed to power, building those data centers quickly within a constrained grid, as well as its normal everyday operations where the data center load can be quite variable depending on the type of data center it is. If it's, for example, an inference-based data center for AI inference, then the load will be variable based on what people are asking their Claude or ChatGPT, what questions they're asking at different times. So that can be very variable. And what a battery is able to do is manage that load variability into smoothed out load shapes to interact with the grid. So throughout that operation, it helps with the ramp in that demand to make it easier to manage that load.
Great. We have another question from David Abraham. They ask, how does battery dispatch used for arbitrage figure in as a benefit? And doesn't arbitrage minimize the main benefits of load shaving, energy shifting, and ancillary?
Well, I guess there's the fundamental matching of generation and demand. So just taking that step back to look at how do you time match generation with load? That's a very simple exercise of in periods where there's lower load and higher generation, the battery storage is moving that excess generation to a time when load is higher and generation is lower. And that variability, there's variability based on just load shapes from our day-to-day patterns, but also variability as we see more renewables on the system. So I think that's the kind of physics of how batteries contribute in terms of energy arb is ultimately shifting energy from a time of abundance to a time of scarcity. In terms of how it manifests in markets, those market prices are just a signal for whether it's a time where you have extra supply or not enough supply, right? So by having battery inserted in those periods in the markets to respond to those price signals, more batteries do result in reduction in their price signal. So it does cannibalize a little bit of those price signals, but that's kind of by design, right? Like, so you have strong price signals to shift energy from a time of abundance to a time of need. Adding a battery reduces those price signals because that's in the response to those price signals. So I guess what I'm trying to interpret is that it's kind of by design that batteries are reducing some of those price signals as they enter, but ultimately there's a balance because batteries aren't free. Storage isn't free. There's a capex cost, there's degradation cost, maintenance cost. So there's only an extent in which those price signals can compress.
Great. Thanks, Felix. This one is a quick, it might just be a citation check. Nikhil Kumar asks, slide 18 suggested 6% of global energy storage additions were LDES. Yeah, I think it's the top right bullet there. Is that 10 plus hour or longer? And it's all right, again, if we need to go back.
Yeah, this one I believe was referring to batteries 8 hours or longer.
Great. We have another question from Tim Miller. He asks, is there an effective policy combination of a short-term state-level procurement requirement to get the ball rolling, followed by a move to integrated system planning coming soon thereafter?
I think that's a very workable version of series of events, right? And that's how a lot of other markets, as we've shown in California and New York, has come about it in that to get that initial scale, having mandated procurements and then having a longer term system that encourages that recognition of value for storage. And the Pacific Northwest not being that market oriented. In other markets, it might be a resource adequacy price signal. In the Pacific Northwest, it might be that changing of how we plan things in the utilities.
Great. I think we're nearing the end of our list of questions. There's one from Laura Burford. They ask, as someone who is very supportive of PBR, I found that recommendation to be helpful for the Pacific Northwest and more broadly. But I'm surprised about this being helpful for BESS because I thought the utilities were including those in CapEx, even as transmission assets. Has the Aurora team seen utilities have CapEx bias against storage as transmission in this way?
Um, so I think it depends on firstly, the regulations about whether storage can count as the rate-based asset class. So I think there's a distinction there in how that's counted. But also in terms of like dollar amounts, lines just have a higher dollar figure, right? So I think that's this pure incentive is to build out the lines rather than find alternative ways of managing those upgrades.
And I forgot to mention, she adds an edit to add that it does make sense for DER batteries and broader DER, EE, and DR programs, but curious if it was also meant for utility scale BESS, which I think you may have answered, but
Yes, so I think that's right. So both DER and utility storage can participate and can contribute in that storage as a transmission asset use case.
I also think that's something that contributes to performance-based rate making also being helpful for utility scale batteries is that there's some lack of clarity in regulation around whether batteries can sort of receive payment from, or whether utilities can collect revenues from both the benefit of batteries meeting peak demand, but also reducing like transmission costs. So there's like the double counting of it.
great. I think that captures all of for the purposes of the report you've just presented on, captures all the questions we got in the chat. Again, I really encourage folks to reach out to us after the fact. And again, just thanks to the Aurora team for presenting on that. There are just a couple other things. Oh, we've got another question that just came in. We have lots of time, so I'm happy to ask it. I do want to save a little bit of time towards the end. I know there was a lot of activity in the chat related to both our sort of policy, siting and permitting related work, so we can touch on that again. And of course, a lot of activity on our ELCC analysis coming up as well. I want to give Mike an opportunity to chat about that, mostly just to let everyone know that information is still incoming. So you haven't missed out on anything quite yet. But I'll maybe just ask this last question that came in. You spoke to the value of interconnection queue reform. Outside of BPA, where does the authority live to implement these policies? I can maybe jump in very quickly and say that one of the things Renewable Northwest has been tracking is FERC's Order 2023 process. So that was basically the requirement for utilities to go from a first come, first serve to a cluster-based first ready, first serve process. So that has occurred some time ago. That's the first example that comes to mind. But are there other places I'm not thinking of?
Yeah, I guess also at the state level. So some recent examples of that in the Pacific Northwest. There was a Senate bill that was recently passed to establish the Washington Electric Transmission Authority. and that's meant to push transmission projects through a little bit faster. And then Oregon also tried to establish an electric transmission authority, but that didn't end up passing. And then there's been a number of permitting reforms initiated at the Washington and Oregon state level. So I guess like the state legislature.
Great. And Tim, I'm reading your question as well. It says, wondering, side question for audience experts, whether BESS is included in Oregon's recent passage to push utility use of GETs. I may do a quick pause and see if anyone in the audience knows the answer to that. But if not, Tim, we can get you that answer after the webinar.
This is Katie. I do believe BESS is included in the GETS bill.
Amazing. Thanks, Katie, our Oregon Senior Policy Manager here at Renewable Northwest. Thanks, Katie. Okay.